Good afternoon. My name is Laure Murat. I'm a professor in the French department, French and Francophone Studies department, and the director of the Center for European and Russian Studies. Embarrassing, but you know. On November 5th, 2016, Gil Orberg, professor in the Department of Comparative Literature, and myself were at Berkeley, where Judith Butler was moderating a panel with the Pussy Riot before a huge, enthusiastic crowd, as usual. At dinner, we were all very confident about the result of the election. Early in the morning of November 9th, I received, as many of my colleagues, a message from Gil calling for action, protest, and resistance. That is how RAVE, Resistance Against Violence Through Education, started, thanks to Gil's initiative and energy. Since then, Gil and I always conjured up our last day under the old regime together with Judith Butler. You know, many people know, well, everybody knows what he or she was doing, but you were not born, for most of you, on 9/11. I mean, with Gil, we always remember what we were, where we were just before the election. We are extremely honored and happy, needless to say, that Judith Butler generously, very generously, accepted to give a talk for our RAVE group, an event co-sponsored by the Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA. Luskin, thank you, Ananya Roy, my friend and comrade. As everybody knows, Judith Butler, Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley, author of many books translated into more than 20 languages, is one of the most important thinkers today, from queer theory, a field she contributed to create, to feminist, moral, and political philosophy. Her most recent books include Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, 2012, Dispossession, The Performative and the Political, co-authored with Athena Athanasiou, 2013, Censors of the Subject and Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, 2015, and in 2016 she published a co-edited volume, Vulnerability in Resistance, with Duke University Press. When Judith Butler gave me the title of her talk, This is What Resistance Looks Like, which is the most beautiful title ever, she added in a separate email in relation to the flyer, because Judith Butler is one of the funniest person I know. Of course, I'm not what resistance looks like, so if you advertise, include a fabulous image of the demonstrations in LA. What we did. I regret a little to have listened to your advice, because actually you are what resistance looks like. Since you represent and embody for decades now so many fights against patriarchy, homophobia, racism, Islamophobia, apartheid, xenophobia, authoritarian and fascist regime, and I'm sorry to say, etc., etc. Everything that has now a new umbrella name, Trumpism. As I'm talking, the Department of Homeland Security, through its enforcement arm, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the famous ICE, is conducting raids throughout Southern California, targeting individuals with or without prior removal or deportation orders. This includes people who do not have any criminal records. In these very dark times, we definitely need to know what resistance looks like. Judith Butler's talk will be followed by a conversation with Ananya Roy and Gil Ochberg. Please join me in welcoming warmly Professor Judith Butler.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry that there was trouble with the airlines and I don't know, various forms of hilarity along the way, tarmac trouble, you know. In any case, I'm very glad to be here, and I want to thank Laure, Gil, and Ananya for their kind and generous invitation, but also for entrusting me with this topic, which is very hard, because I think, in fact, we are all taking in information all the time and trying to analyze it, and then it shifts, and then we have to reanalyze, and we have to throw it away, whatever it was we were working on, and then try again. And it's hard to think in the middle of this kind of chaotic acceleration. So what I have today are some thoughts in progress, which may not hold in 10 days. I think this is probably not an academic talk. I don't know, I'm not sure exactly whether I should be giving academic talks anymore, or maybe half the time. Maybe half the time. I'm trying to figure that out. I think we're all probably in a quandary like that. So the truth is, I'm not altogether glad to be here because the political times are so demanding and infuriating. I said I would talk about resistance, what resistance looks like. So I'll say a few words about where I am seeing resistance, what forms it takes, and what those forms have to say to us about the future contours of a struggle. If you are someone who never talked about the struggle before, or who looked askance at people who referred to resistance or even fascism in the US, you may well be feeling immediately skeptical. At the same time, so many people find themselves reaching for words they would not ordinarily use, and I suppose my reflections today are about why that is happening. If we were operating within a broadly liberal left position, we tended to understand the basic structure in which that made sense, but now we are perhaps in a shared uncertainty about whether a framework for liberal or constitutional democracy is collapsing in new ways, and what it is we now call the struggle we are in. It is, of course, possible to say that the struggle is against Trump, but that is to accept that this singular man who has assumed executive power is the name of the problem we have. Of course, I agree that he is a problem, and we can use his name to describe that problem, but let us reflect for a moment on the proper name as a kind of shorthand, an abbreviation or condensation of a more complex set of problems. So though many of us are surely opposing Trump, although I don't know, maybe the College Republican Party is here, and if so, I welcome you. I've been in conversation with them at Berkeley, many of them more thoughtful than some of the people they choose to invite. So although many of us are surely opposing Trump, we have to ask, what does Trump stand for? How is that name signifying? But also, what form opposition or resistance may take, which one of those words, in fact, do we use? In my view, opposition is one term that suggests that our political structures are basically intact, but that we position ourselves against the one embodied by Trump. But if what is at stake are basic legal processes and even constitutional democracy, then we are actually fighting for democracy, which means that we are part of a resistance movement. If democracy were secure under the current regime, we would be part of a social movement or a political party that opposes the party in power. I was more than prepared to elect Hillary Clinton and to oppose her, okay, but I was not prepared for Trump to be elected and to become part of a resistance movement. Okay, so that's how I see it. In some ways, we would be in the same old scene if we were simply opposing the party in power from the position of another party. We would lament the results of an election, but we would accept, it's okay, yes, I am shorter than people think. It's all good. It's all good. Okay. In that case, if we were just in an opposition party, constitutional democracy would still be in place. But now we're in some different kind of trouble because the fear we have, I think, is that we are no longer just an oppositional party or movement. We're actually fighting now for the conditions in which oppositional parties and movements still make sense. That is why the name of this fight needs to be resistance. Although we may think that questions of language have very little to do with the most serious threats we are facing, including widespread racism, the threat of deportation for the undocumented, bans on travel from countries with a preponderance of Muslims, license to commit acts of overt discrimination against a wide range of minorities, the rolling back of environmental protections, the skepticism toward climate change and science itself, reckless threats on the global stage, increased militarization, increased license for police who kill, and for the prison industry that devastates the lives of a disproportionate number of Black and brown men and women, but also the decimation of the humanities and the arts, the effort to dismantle the political and legal accomplishment of feminism and civil rights, the massive enlargement of the executive branch, the prospect of authoritarian, if not fascist, rule. But consider that many of the reactions to Trump so far have been a reaction to his words, his tweets, his phrases, most of which lack full sentence structure, and few of which ever assume the form of a paragraph. His actions are fewer, and there seems to be a degree of confusion about what constitutes an act in his case. We still do not know which bits of his language are statements of intention, which bits are meant to be provocative and make us wonder, which bits can actually become executive commands or decrees that do not require congressional action. Of course, it is clear that his speech seeks to keep us unknowing about what he can and will do. So we produce a large number of words seeking to decipher his often quite truncated utterances. It is as if the medium of the tweet produces an elaborate response from more conventional journalistic prose, at which point the battle becomes one between forms of expression within the political field. I would like from the outset to distinguish between two dimensions of executive utterance. Don't worry, it's not all going to be about language. But it's important. Okay. The first is one that appears to be a statement of intention, and so it is not yet an act. He claims that he would punch someone in the face, or that he will lock up Hillary, or that he will build a wall, or that he will wipe out ISIS. He does not do this, but claims he will, and he waits to see whether he's accorded the power to do what he wishes. The second aspect of his speech is to make the speech into an act itself, precipitating a set of consequences or responses, waiting to see whether the power of the speech act translates into political power. The speech acts are efforts to establish his own power, and so to secure the conditions by which he can execute what he wishes. Trump and his handlers are trying to establish reality through speech, wielding the speech act in ways that strengthen the effect of Trump's sovereign power. According to that view, what Trump says is true, or rather becomes true, because he says it. His authority does not precede the Speech Act. The Speech Act seeks to establish his authority to declare what is true. So that means, in our response, we have to check to see whether he really does have the authority or is simply acting as if he does, making us think that the overreach of power has already taken place. It is at those moments that we think we are living in accomplished fascism. More on that term later. Luckily, we have ways of responding still, demonstrations and posters and placards and cartoons. I'm loving cartoons, satire, and a form of free speech that exposes this very ruse time and again. We will have to fight for a very strong freedom of the press to counter this man's dangerous tactics. And we see that the verbal attacks on the press are themselves an instance of what I'm seeking to draw out. He claims that the press is unfair or rigged, or Bannon claims that it is the opposition, at which point we have every reason to fear that there will be an attack on press freedoms that realizes, puts into action censorship. We see how Erdogan in Turkey arrests people who make fun of him. Is Trump so very different? Will it come to that? We are right to ask these questions, but we also have to be careful not to hand over that power before it is actually assumed. In other words, if we take his Speech Act as an executive command, as an accomplished, effective executive command, unconditioned and efficacious, then he will be able to translate bluster into policy with greater ease, which is one reason to call the bluff time and again. He needs the Congress to defund Berkeley. He needs the courts to approve his miserable ban. He needs the Supreme Court to roll back reproductive rights. He needs the support of the Republican Party to continue to govern with ease. And at least as of this afternoon, they were falling apart at an accelerating rate. So this is one reason to call the bluff time and again. He needs a wide array of civil and public servants to implement his discriminatory programs and his deportations. I'm mindful that at least last week, at least 680 people were rounded up for deportation, and that is an appalling and documented truth. At the same time, and this is also true, there's now some good evidence that he will be confronted increasingly with refusals to comply, with forms of non-implementation and civil disobedience. If the vets are going to Standing Rock, what else is possible? In fact, non-implementation will be one form that resistance takes. We will be taking to the streets for sure, but there may also be a large number of people who are refusing to perform their assigned tasks, and that form of non-action also belongs to our conception of contemporary resistance. So I will leave the problem of language in a moment, but I want to underscore that the relation of language and power is part of power, and a very specific part of contemporary power. The speech of one man, even if he is president and trying to become an authoritarian, does not by itself have the power to destroy democratic law and convention. He has to be supported by his party or Congress or by the army or the police or by the polls. Without some form of support, he is powerless, and the less support he has, the more powerless he will be. As soon as he was elected, a resistance movement began at both the national and global level. So now we are in the midst of a struggle over over values and the binding power of constitutional democracy. He does not have absolute power to define the terms of that struggle. We are in the midst of defining them. We are in the midst of that struggle. In the last weeks, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children filled the streets demonstrating at the Women's March, but also on separate occasions against deportation, against the pipeline crossing native lands in North Dakota. Since so many people were outraged by Trump's election, by his documented history as a sexual harasser, his vulgar and demeaning treatment of women, and his obvious lack of commitment to gender equality or to upholding the laws that oppose sexual violence and coercion. Some would call what we have seen on the streets a civil rights movement, but again, I want to argue that it is a complex and sometimes surprising resistance movement. It includes civil servants and judges, entire police departments, city governments, a network of lawyers who either block or refuse to implement his deportation plans, and his Islamophobic ban on immigration and travel. Those who are already speaking against him are both Republicans and Democrats, but also third parties of various kinds. To some extent, they all fear the destruction of basic rights and liberties, the death of the living legacy of civil rights, the loss of protection against discrimination for all minorities, the rights of the undocumented, all of which are derived from constitutional democracy and broader commitments to equality, dignity, and freedom within civil society. So though this may well look like a civil rights movement starting again, it may well be a movement in defense of the Constitution, the separation of powers, and the limits imposed on executive power. It's important to remember as well and to call upon our transnational alliances at times such as these, for resistance must become global to become effective. We are seeing in graphic form the rise of xenophobic nationalism in Germany, Austria, France, the UK, Hungary, Poland, and Switzerland. So we have to be able to oppose racism through a broad transnational movement. Such movements include local struggles against national xenophobic agendas, focusing not only on the protection of Syrian migrants, but the Roma as well. These are all sites for transversal forms of solidarity. Although in the US, many of us have become understandably absorbed by our new elected government, we would do well, I wager, to grasp that some of the issues we are dealing with are transnational in scope. I mentioned racism, but let us also think about the way that accelerating economic inequalities and the devastation of social infrastructures have plunged large numbers of people across the globe into conditions of precarity. In fact, throughout Europe, there are debates on precarity and populism, on whether neoliberal economics and finance capital have produced forms of devastation that have compelled people to take a rightward turn toward neo-fascism or state racism. Some argue that populism is itself the problem, and that it is to be understood as, by definition, right-wing and a force of ressentiment. But others argue that populism is nothing other than a popular groundswell that can turn left or right, or stay in the middle, and that is more of a condition awaiting a political articulation than a political position itself. My own view is that it is a condition awaiting a political articulation, often a pre-political rage that is looking for ways to name and oppose whatever power it is that has produced an unlivable way of life. Ernesto Laclau made the argument time and again in the last years of his life that articulating the popular will is a complex matter, and it is hardly the case that at any given time we can say for sure that the people have spoken or who the people really are. The most persuasive accounts of populism seek to take account of radical discontent, but in such a way that one can envision how various factions, identities, and particular interests can become linked with one another in a democratizing process without losing their various specificities. For Laclau, this effort to articulate, in the Gramscian sense, a series of connections among diverse identities is the ongoing challenge of populism. I would add identities, interests, particular movements. That happens by finding the rallying point, the issue, the symbol, the sign that draws people together and that hosts their various investments without always reconciling their differences. It is certainly not about a fascist convergence into a single will, nor is it about finding a charismatic leader who ostensibly unifies the public. Of course, there are right and left versions of populism, and populism itself constitutes neither a full political position nor a political party. The solidarities that can be potentially arrived at through various modes of mobilization have to produce a left majority that can elect a government that seeks to secure democracy in both its formal and substantive senses. A left majority is not a single mind. It is a convergence of concerns that discover that their specific aims can be backgrounded for the purposes of making the tie of solidarity, extending what Laclau called the chain of equivalence. This was a hopeful vision for Laclau, one that was wrought in the context of democratic mobilizations that brought down dictatorships in Latin America. I do not think it is fully applicable to our own political situation, but there are some points of relevance. For instance, we know that 50% of the population of the US eligible to vote did not vote, and that seems to be a result of both disenchantment with electoral politics, indifference or full-scale cynicism, and also voter suppression, especially in areas where there are many African American voters. So one of the very first tasks we have before us is how to bring the non-voter back into politics, to find out the reasons why people don't vote and to address them in terms that are popular and persuasive enough to bring them in. Another one of those first tasks is to expose voter suppression and to use the courts to invalidate discriminatory actions at the polls. These very practical issues should concern anyone who is mobilizing for the left. They relate to the broader question, what is the popular will? Who are the people? And how might the various wants of the people actually become articulated so that government can and does represent whatever then counts as their will? For as we know, the person who currently occupies the White House received only about 23% of support from the voting public, so that means about 77%, but if I'm still doing math, if math still works, sorry, so that means that 77% did not vote for him, which means that the depoliticized public has to become repoliticized. There are political reasons why there is a depoliticized public, right? And that is our job, to find the political reasons for widespread depoliticization. How can we be a part of that process? The president operates with a rather blatant lack of legitimacy. Of course, he was elected through legitimate means, but he does not represent anything that we might call the popular will. This leads him to lie about how few people were on the mall on Inauguration Day, to maintain that he would have had the popular vote had the system not been rigged, etc. His compensatory rhetoric actually concedes the very point he hopes to refute. In this way, he's not altogether clever. And he does not seem to care that his falsehoods are recognized as such. Couldn't care less. His aim is to wield power, and if he wields it strongly enough, his wager is that he will be able to establish the very terms of truth. Because he does not represent the people, Trump tries to produce the impression that he definitely represents the people simply by claiming that he does. The power of the Speech Act performed by executive power, is meant to counteract the reality to which it tacitly attests. It is a wager he runs. Saying so makes it so, especially if he is the one who's saying it. Of course, we're on the 4th grade playground at such a moment, but we might as well admit that we are and see what we can make of it and what to do. Most of his speech acts are efforts to produce the effect of truth, to make it seem as if his election had popular consent and legitimacy, even though it is obvious that he lacks popular consent and in that respect lacks legitimacy. Now, that means that he operates already within language as an authoritarian. If I say it is true, and it is true because I say it, right? We don't even stay in the same room with people who talk like that. In other words, the way in which his speech acts operate is to install his own authoritarian power. So when he speaks as if he's representing the people, he's actually operating as an authoritarian. But he's not yet been able to accomplish that at the level of law and policy. So let us contemplate what difference it makes that he produces it in language. Is it produced there precisely because he cannot yet produce it elsewhere? Or does he produce it there because he wants to compel us to accept his authority and his legitimacy so that he can drive through the policies he wants? If he is compelling our consent, then we do have some choice in that matter, right? So holding back before we imagine, oh, it's a president, he said this, therefore this is what's happening. Right, and as soon as we go into like the full-scale panic, we fail to actually see, does he not have that power at this moment? Is he trying to achieve that power by scaring us in that way? So keep your mind. There should be a way to show that he does not, we're going to talk about keeping our minds in a moment. There should be a way to show that he does not represent the popular will, but this leads us to the more general problem, whether the popular will can ever be determined. The problem with any claim to represent the people is that the people are never fully represented by any claim. They are condensed and abbreviated and calculated by a particular vote. And whoever they are, they exceed the electoral representation, the electoral representatives. Indeed, even as the people elect officials, or some of the people do at any rate, they do not stop exercising popular power once those elected representatives are in office. Popular movements opposing particular decisions or policies are examples of popular power that not only exceeds electoral power, but must exceed it for electoral representatives to have any legitimacy at all. In other words, the people have to consent to have those elected representatives served. They also have the power to withdraw their consent, right? So let's remember that there is always that popular basis for electoral government. There should be. In other words, as much as the people in voting allow themselves to be represented by those who win the majority vote, at least under our system, they also can withdraw their consent to be governed when it becomes clear that those elected have assumed powers in ways that are clearly unjust. So whoever the people may be, they are never fully identified with any particular electoral result. And when they exercise the power to bring down a government or remove a president from office, they make clear that they do not support the government as it is. The withdrawal of popular consent from the government signals the loss of legitimacy. Hannah Arendt made this clear in her essay on civil disobedience, when she wrote, and I quote, that we all live and survive by a kind of tacit consent, which, however, it would be difficult to call voluntary. This last phrase alone is interesting, since what would an involuntary consent be? Perhaps she is suggesting that we are only aware in situations of crisis how much we depend on an enduring compact, at least those of us who are documented citizens. For those who are undocumented, or those of us who are regularly the object of police violence and imprisonment, that compact can hardly be said to have held. In other words, it was always in question. Indeed, there are a wide range of people who have never felt those conditions of basic trust in a democratic compact, requiring that tacit consent. The fact is that democracy is not a presumption of our lives, but a constant struggle. But many of us who are relatively privileged have felt the trust in that compact shaken. If we ask what was it that was shaken in us, we may be aware of a trust, however partial and challenged that might be, in abiding political structures, rights and obligations, due process, checked executive power, separation of church and state, rights to one's own life, rights against violent intrusion, detention, and deportation. So perhaps we can say that even those of us who have been skeptical about whether we ever lived in a democracy are still shaken, didn't know we could be further shaken, suggesting that our cynicism and our cool was not quite as complete as we thought it was. But being shaken or even shocked is not all bad. Some people say, oh, don't be shocked. Why are people shocked? Of course, the U.S. was always a fascist country, was always capable of fascism, nobody should be shocked. Hey, let's be shocked, let's be shocked into action, right? It's still shocking when fascism happens. It should always remain shocking. We should never be too cool. We should always be, in some sense, able to respond effectively with outrage. If we're not shocked at all, I'm not sure we can act and shake up things in return. So in some limited ways, I'm following Hannah Arendt's argument in her essay on civil disobedience, though surely not all her views in that essay. Indeed, that essay includes moments when her racist views surge to the surface. The point she makes that I do accept is that under conditions of constitutional crisis, and it certainly seems we're heading into a very large one, there follows, and I quote, a loss of confidence in constitutional processes by the people, one that can be understood as a withdrawal of consent. Civil disobedience is one way to withdraw consent, but this she regards less as an act of the individual than an exercise of the freedom of association. So even one person who refuses to implement a roundup or a deportation is implicitly or explicitly acting in concert with others who have also determined that it would be unjust to implement an unjust policy. And if that association expands to become a movement, and increasing numbers of people withdraw consent by exercising civil disobedience, then a government's rule is exposed as lacking popular legitimation. Its former supporters disperse or turn against it. It will happen. Or collapse becomes possible, and so too does a new political reality have a chance to emerge. So when an elected government loses legitimacy on such occasions, when it loses popular support, it can always continue to rule by force, but only if the army or the police continue to support the regime. If they fail to support the regime, it cannot rule and it must collapse. As we know, if the person occupying executive power under our Constitution has committed crimes or is established to be unfit, then he can be impeached and removed. The final consequence of illegitimate rule is removal from office. That is the endpoint toward which this problem of lack of legitimacy leads. It could happen if conflicts of interest are exposed, if blackmail by a foreign power is revealed. I'm just going to say that I don't really care if he's into golden showers. It's not my business. The golden showers is not the problem. It's whether he was blackmailed on the basis of the photograph of the... But that's just hearsay. We don't know. But I just want to say those are distinct issues. Okay. Okay, all right. Okay, sorry. Conspiring with a foreign power to influence an election, if that can be proven. Seeking to dismantle the judiciary branch, if that starts to be realized. If the army's deployed against the population of Chicago or its African American communities, if his crimes against women are prosecuted, if his mental health is established as pathological and he is deemed unfit to serve in that office, if his policies contravene laws banning discrimination on the basis of race or religion. It seems that our Constitution orchestrates the ways in which he may be shown the exit. Trump's own rhetoric seems to concede the problem of his own legitimacy deficit, one that, if it intensifies, can imperil his term and force it to end early. He insists there were crowds, that he won by a landslide, and so produces a discourse that obviously emphatically seeks to compensate for a truth he already knows. This shows somewhere he actually does know the truth, but he doesn't really care about representing it. So I'm suggesting that it may be precisely that what the resistance movement is about, or what it needs to be about, is a widespread withdrawal of consent that can take various forms, and that does put the legitimacy of this presidency into question in such a way that removal is possible. For the popular will to emerge in a form that effectively withdraws consent from this administration, it would have to be widespread and effective. So when we ask what mobilizes people across all kinds of regions and political differences to join a movement that seeks to impeach and remove a president, or to build a movement that will translate into electoral victories for a compelling and just opposition, we are confronted with the problem of how to address basic passions, including widespread economic despair, destitution, and unpayable debt, the loss of jobs, prospects, the very sense of the future. But also how to appeal to those values of equality and cohabitation that envision a multiracial and multi-ethnic polity in which people live together on the basis of equality. How do those affirmative passions become cultivated by those of us who have by those of us who wish to contest this administration? So I spoke briefly about populism, and I want to say something here, because I am saying that we need to make an appeal to passion. We need to make a passionate appeal. We need to understand what a passionate desire for democracy might look like, and how is it that we represent that in such a way that people do discover and articulate that desire. Now, some people oppose populism because it's said to be based on an irrational way of feeling. It's said to be unintelligent. It's said to be destructive. But that attitude toward populism also has some highly emotional features. It's virulent, it's denunciatory, it's dismissive, and it sometimes comes from a position of cultural elitism. As I said, I don't think populism is a political position. One might call a party populist and mean something by that name. But populism is not its own agenda. It's the name for a political situation in which some part of the population, acting as the people or understanding themselves as the people, are mobilized and galvanized for a political purpose. This can take an utterly hideous form, such as Pegida in Germany, or UKIP in the UK, or Le Front National in France, the Jobbik Party in Hungary, all of which are mobilizing against migrants composed of white and movements that are composed of white supremacists. We see a version of this in the anti-migrant white supremacists, very often overt Nazis mobilizing for Trump. And yet populism can also describe the campaigns of Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, or other movements where there is emotionally compelling rhetoric on the left. By rhetoric, I include all the various means of persuasion, including argument itself. If I am right that populism names a condition of being politically galvanized, if indignation and debt and rage are tapped, then the question emerges, what is the framework that makes sense of this rage, that compels people to move in one direction or another, to make solidarities of one sort rather than another? From a sense of dispossession or demoralization, political views can lurch right, for sure. We're living with the consequences of that lurch. But what if a common understanding of inequality or exclusion were constructed that was able to articulate various social positions with one another across divergent regions, linking those who did not expect to be in each other's company? We can think ourselves as having a Gramscian task, that is, to think about the means for bringing the depoliticized into the political field, and to think about the kind of framework we want to offer to compel those who have given up on the electoral process, or found their voting rights compromised, or never considered themselves as part of that public that would incite new political aspirations. This can happen through mass mobilization, but also through the accumulation of individual acts of protest or disobedience that call upon associations and solidarities that are not fully predictable. Perhaps such repeated and enduring actions, as well as the refusals to act, are ways to feel the prospect of being lifted up through those emerging forms of solidarity. If it is true that some percentage of people who voted for Sanders voted for Trump, then it may well follow that some percentage of Trump voters can be persuaded to vote for someone like Sanders. What is the means of persuasion? So though I am focusing on electoral politics at this moment, I'm also talking about the time we have, the time of mobilization, to cultivate or incite new forms of solidarity between now and the next set of elections that could and should deprive Trump of his Republican majority. What would an inspiring solidarity look like? It's already happened. It only has to expand. What would compel people to come together? They are already coming together, and they need to come together again and more. Would those solidarities be those we already know, or would they take on another form? And through what political structures should we act? These are some of the open questions that require our best common reflection and deliberation. I alone do not have ready answers to those questions. I, working alone, cannot possibly answer those questions. The effective alliance forming now is one that is not exactly like those we have already seen. Perhaps it's a moment to consider the unlikely allies, the police departments that refuse to deport. Good. I mean, I'm so used to opposing the police. It's like, oh, okay. You're right? I mean, but let's allow that. Let's be stopped and disoriented by that. It doesn't mean we love them now or we're best friends. No, I'm not actually in favor of love as the basis of solidarity. I'm definitely not. The universities and towns that claim now sanctuary status, the liberal lawyers who stay up all night to stop an immigration policy that is overtly discriminatory. I'm usually arguing with them. The farmers who oppose the deportation of their workers, the city councils and town halls that decry the decimation of the Affordable Health Care Act, often stacked with Republicans, fearing the loss of coverage for people who have no other choice. We could consolidate the left on the basis of those with whom we feel clear identification. They share our goals and aspirations. They're already convinced of everything we also believe. I understand how compelling it is to identify. I have surely in the last weeks felt the need for small gatherings of the like-minded, one of the few consolations we can find. We can name the list of identities that have composed the left, but can we name as easily the principles under which those identities gather? Identification cannot always be the basis of alliance. What would it mean to include those with whom we do not readily identify, but whose sense of justice, equality, or freedom is radically contravened by the current government? Is identification still a sufficient basis for solidarity, or is it time to ally with those we never expected to respect? The police who refuse to deport, the immigration officer who refuses to discriminate, the civil servant who refuses to implement the unjust policy, the liberal jurist who wants nothing of leftism but who is seeking to save key provisions of the Constitution, the rabbis whose views on the Middle East are impossible to share but who object to the Trump administration's aim to destroy the rights of refugees and the international law by which they are stipulated. Okay. My sense is that an alliance of those who refuse to comply, to implement, those who actively block or passively resist, will not comprise just the usual allies, but also those we did not expect to find and who we would be foolish to reject. Instead, a resistance movement does not take a single form. It spreads and emerges in sites where that are relatively unforeseeable. Mass demonstrations remain crucial for showing that at least some powerful version of the people refuse these injustices. But equally necessary are the very acts of noncompliance that undermine the efficacy of executive policy. If he gives an order and no one implements it, he does not have that power. Noncompliance is one way of withdrawing consent. It takes courage and legal support and networks of solidarity. It should not be a solitary act of heroism. It should be an act that bespeaks the broader popular objection carried out in concert with others. It matters if you call your representative every morning, put the number in your cell phone. It matters if you call your representative every morning to say why you think a policy is wrong or to enumerate the possible grounds for impeachment and removal. Of course, it is time for rising up, not just once or twice, but regularly every week. But it is also time for sitting down, for failing to show up, refusing to answer, for finding various forms of civil disobedience that can cumulatively become a movement, a resistance movement. For those of us who work in universities, our tasks can be both local and significant. Our first task is to make sure that our universities become sanctuaries where undocumented students and staff are protected against being identified, detained, and deported. We must insist on widespread noncompliance, and each of you knows people on the staff, on the faculty, and in the university administration who have the power to say no to that demand, even if it means the threat of losing federal funding. I thought Jerry Brown was pretty good when he said, we're not going to pay taxes to you. I thought that was great. Secession. Really, what's he going to do without our tax base? Okay. We have now also to fight for affordable public education. Let us not fully give up on that, no matter how absurd it sounds, given the new Secretary of Education. Privatization has gained a terrifying ally in her. We have to come together as well to defend the National Endowment of the Humanities and the National Endowment of the Arts. And it's not just that those are institutions somewhere in Washington. They are, and they fund and support all kinds of people. But if there's an attack on the humanities, and if there's an attack on the arts, and if science itself is being called into question, it's an attack on all of us and on the very project of knowledge and of the university. It's not just that sentence structure has suffered some of its worst blows in the history of Western civilization under the Trump regime. Right, we also have to have some humor during this time. I mean, if you don't, you're okay, I'm just saying. But that educational institutions and the arts are the occasions when we reflect back upon our history, our present, our future. We articulate values. We teach the art of interpretation, of making the world anew, of calling into question false claims and destructive forms of historical amnesia. Both the arts and the humanities give us back our worlds in imaginary form, allowing us to grasp history and the future in a knowing way. And although it sounds strange, we are suddenly in the situation where we have to make the public case for knowledge. Perhaps we start again at the most basic level, underscoring why reading and writing are important for our shared lives, why learning when Frederick Douglass lived and what he said on the 4th of July in 1852, how to spell the name of the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who clearly anticipated the distortion that would seize his name, what the Constitution actually stipulated and how it has been interpreted through time. Perhaps it's also a moment for all of us to learn again the histories of authoritarian rule and fascist regimes within a transnational frame so that we can become wise about the contemporary forms they now take and plot our resistance on the basis of a firm and incisive understanding. For how are we to live, to cohabit a world without the arts and the humanities opening up the possibility of critical thought, the kind that both dismantles injustice and envisions a more just world? There can be no envisioning without the language arts. It is the art of language to envision. It belongs to the arts, whether linguistic or not, to envision, to give us the world through a refracted lens so that we can reflect and think, and so that our action can be reflective and thoughtful. As much as we carry on in our seminars and lectures, preserving the importance of what we do, we also have now to face the public in new ways and with new language to show that what we do is indispensable for public life, that it is itself a public good worth fighting for. This room for thinking, the one we inhabit together now, is a value worth fighting for. Finally, I know that there's a difference between the kinds of alliance that might stop him from acting and even bring him down, and the alliance that's needed to produce a serious alternative political movement that can translate into a new party or a new electoral horizon. For those of us who woke up after the election wondering who belongs to this United States, who voted in this way, we will probably have to learn more about what people fear, how they suffer, what they want, and how to challenge the fear and the hatred that overwhelmed us and overwhelms us still. I am sure that we have to become smarter about the radical acceleration of inequality within the current economy. But we ought not to fall into the trap of thinking that the racist revolt, the attack on migrants, the attack on women are all secondary effects of a prior economic situation. The contemporary constellation of power is complex. Racism has its long and persistent history spanning slavery to prison. Misogyny has survived feminism, and the proponents of misogyny now target feminism as fascist or as the moral police rather than as a movement that affirms equality and freedom. So it's not a matter of reconsolidating a left that was, but of moving forward with that history, taking account of the new forms of economic precarity in which so many people now live with transient work and unpayable debts, but also the contemporary forms of racism and misogyny and xenophobia. It's up to us to show in clear and popular terms how precarity is produced by neoliberal economics, expanding markets, deregulation, all of which work in tandem with the destruction of social interdependency, social democracy, and economic and social justice. We can even show how precarity traverses all the social categories of class, race, sexuality, gender, ability, religion. So one task is to try to offer a persuasive and popular account of why people are suffering in the ways that they are and what they can do about it. If the left could do this and propose a way to rebuild social democratic infrastructures, even to re-envision democratic socialism, then we might have reasons to hope. But for those who voted for Trump thinking they would gain financially under his administration, those who said, oh, I know he said those terrible things, but still, I'm going to make a profit under his administration. What did they do? Well, they set aside his misogyny and his racism. And their accommodation has proven to be a fateful form of complicity. Their desire for fewer taxes, expanding markets, increased profit margins, their desires to bust unions and outsource as they please, to destroy the environment in the service of greater production, were clearly more important to them than living in a world defined by its commitments to equality, inclusion, non-discrimination. That's okay. It's a good song. And even basic constitutional rights. The state is now becoming a market state run by billionaires. That's one definition, by the way, of fascism we should be alert to, destroying the distinction between democracy and the free market. So yes, those who told themselves that his racism, xenophobia, and misogyny were just rhetoric engaged in an enormously consequential form of denial or dissociation. The rise of the market state now goes hand in hand with unleashed hatred against minorities, migrants, the undocumented, and women. I am not sure one is the cause of the other. We have to grasp that complexity. So to reestablish a movement, we will have to solicit a desire for democracy, the movement that demonstrates those principles of freedom, equality, interdependency, and inclusion is the one best equipped to actualize those principles in the world. Principles have to be enacted to live, even though they retain an ideal dimension toward which we strive. This is one reason why the radical acts of which we must become capable cannot be any and all acts that bring the administration down. I am actually for that goal, to be sure, but I am not for by any means necessary. Sorry. The reason I do not accept that any and all methods should be used, the reason I do not think that violence is necessary or justified, is that the methods we use carry the burden of prefiguring the world in which we want to live. In acting, we enact a world, and that cannot happen by any means necessary. What world do we bring into being through deploying violence? A violent world. And so there is all the more reason to act in ways that not only withdraw our consent from this regime, amass our bodies on the street to stop governmental actions, join the networks that oppose the wall that divides us from Mexico, even attend a meeting at a city hall, or to do all of this in ways that help to reconstruct and renew our sense of the world as it should be. Our acts carry that aspiration, that image and vision of the world we seek to bring into being. So even as we dismantle, we also build, and every act has to live up to that measure, that double demand. The social and political transformation starts with the small step, the daily call, the weekly demonstration, moving outside of our zone of comfort where we all identify with one another toward the uneasy alliance that stands against injustice. For it will be in the daily surprise, taking action with the neighbor we never knew, that we encounter that exhilarating expanse as resistance takes form. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you very much, Judith, for a beautiful talk and something that we really need right now. We're going to open the discussion between Ananya Roy and Gil Orberg and, of course, Judith Butler. Who wants to start? Gil?
I wasn't really asked if I want. I was told. So thank you, Judith, and I'm sure that everybody has enjoyed the talk profoundly, and I think it's one of the things that were sort of really a surprise to me, still is a surprise to me, is how little has been happening sort of across at least the campuses that I know in terms of breaking the normalization of the everyday teaching structure, which is what RAVE also seeks to do, and talks of this sort. Just very little, and so much appreciated. I want to start with maybe a question about what for me is a haunting question about those, even though we try to tell ourselves it's just a 23%, etc., but those who voted for Trump. Because I think the reason I say it's a haunting question is because I think the question is both, and at the same time, who are they, but also who are we, or who are we becoming? And it seems to me to be a much more sort of a more difficult question than the question of Trump, even Trump and his administration. Because, of course, people say, well, what it is what he did is he just released what was there already, right? I mean, there was all this racism, there was all this sexism, all this misogyny, and here he is, and he just released it all out. If that is true, then if he and his this remarkable orchestrated administration that he has managed to pull are out, then we are still left with that. And what is sort of the role of resistance to that?
Well, I don't think I should answer that.
Oh,
okay.
Judith, thank you for joining us here at UCLA. This is a very special honor, no? Okay. So I think you heard me, which was a thank you to Judith for joining us here at UCLA and bringing us together in this room. So I have, of course, been voraciously reading everything that you have been uttering about Trump, and in a recent collection published in Cultural Anthropology, in your reflections on Trump, you have a provocative statement where you say he lives above the law, and that is where many of his supporters also want to live. And I want to relate that to the statement you made in your talk today about how Trump's authoritarianism finds a home in language, but is not fully as yet accomplished in law and policy. So my question has to do with how we should think about the relationship between the law and the resistance, and particularly if we keep in mind your very influential body of work, and I'm thinking particularly about the book Dispossession, and how we think about how self-authoring personhood has rarely been enabled by the law. In fact, has often been foreclosed by the law. So how then should we think about the ways in which we have already in these first few moments come to rely on the law, or come to rely on the lack of accomplishment of authoritarian power in law and policy? So it's a broad question about the law and the resistance.
I love LA. It's got its own sounds, doesn't it? It's just great. It's just great. I think I'm not sure I have simple answers to this, but it does seem to me that many of us who have perhaps lived on the coasts and hung out with the like-minded, we're not quite aware of what the enormous and vicious hatred of feminism is, for instance, or the enormous and vicious racism that felt itself to be censored. So if you go on Breitbart, which I try not to do, but I also try to do because I actually need to know what's happening there, you see that almost every time the left or feminists are referred to, they're referred to actually as fascists. And it's very interesting that we on the left are trying to figure out, are we in fascism? Do we need to start reading about fascism? We need fascism study groups, and we're going to the historians, and who do we read? But they're pretty clear that that we're fascists. So I think that's been a fringe kind of simmering thing for a long time, but also I think when we say that Trump unleashed that, we have to include here the enormous racism against Mexicans in the United States. When he spoke it, and he spoke it shamelessly, he didn't just release it. Okay, it was like intact, and then he released it. It was like bottled up and then released. He also gave it public forum, which is a way to structure it and also license it and to give it an even more intensified and accelerated life than it could have before. So who knows how that racism and that misogyny could have been dealt with at another level or in a different time or by another figure or by another discourse. But I think we can't imagine that it was fully intact. It was obviously there in some form and then was constellated and restructured through and licensed through the license that he offered it. At least that's how I'm thinking of it. I don't know if I'm right, but that's just my current thought. And I guess also, even during the election, I found there was a lot of joking about, does he read? He doesn't read. And then I thought, has he ever read the Constitution? Like, how seriously does he take that as a text? He never mentions the Constitution. And of course, it seems as if every issue is something to be brokered. There are no basic principles that have to be defended or, and certainly no principles that have taken textual form to which we refer when we make a legal decision, or when we. I mean, it's let's see what the courts do. And the idea that when he says that the court system is broken, right? That means the court system doesn't agree with him, that it's actually operating in checks and balances, right? So to call checks and balances a broken character of the court system puts him in the position of rectifying this break and even understanding the executive branch as having to reclaim power that has been taken over by the courts. Now, I think that there's also that discourse on the right. When you read about, what the courts have done in advancing civil rights legislation or advancing reproductive rights, or transgender rights, right? Most recently, the courts are called fascist. The courts are called the moral police. The courts are accused of censorship. So I think we have to actually understand that language. I find myself in the very awkward position of wanting to defend constitutional democracy, which I've never done. I think I did in a civics course in high school. I have my left critique, and I don't like possessive individualism, and I don't like abstract rights, and I don't like and there are ways we can see social inequality built into the Constitution, and it presupposed slavery, and it still hasn't really dealt with that, because look at the prison system, and that's the legacy. I can give you my strong left critique of constitutional democracy. But the question is, to what extent was I depending on it as I launched that critique? And that's okay. That's not contradictory. I don't think that's a contradiction. It's a paradox, and it's a bind. But I think it's the bind we want to be in. It's the bind we want to be in. In other words, we don't want all social mobilization to be about the law. It may have to be about the law given our certain circumstances. But I don't idealize the law as the only vehicle for achieving social justice. I don't actually believe that's true. I think we need radical economic restructuring, and we need to think equality and inequality in much more substantial ways than the law possibly can. And the law very often constrains our emancipatory discourses in ways that are very, very painful and unacceptable. And yet to do without it, or to allow a left critique to be taken over by a right one, I think I'm not willing to do. So I am in a paradoxical position at this moment historically. And I think that may well be a shared one.
Can I follow up on this? I would like Judith to follow up a little bit on Gil's question and the role of the intellectuals. Many years ago, I watched on YouTube a very famous interview of Hannah Arendt, and you know, of course, this. Yes, yeah. And it strikes me that she was saying, just before the war, the worst people were the intellectuals. And when I heard that, it hurts me. And I remember I thought, if I'm ever caught in, fascist regime, I will be awakened. That's for sure. So I would like to have your take on this. I was very sensitive in your talk when you talk about the difference between resistance and opposition. And how do you see the role of the intellectuals? Do you feel that there is enough energy right now on campuses? Or, intellectuals are not only on campuses, but mostly I'm in the U.S. Because, as you know, in other countries, specifically in Europe, because we know very well in Europe what is fascism about. Do you think that in the United States right now, there is a mobilization, I mean, strong enough mobilization among the intellectuals. Sorry, yes.
Can I build on that?
Of course, please.
So you gave us a really beautiful and inspiring picture and vision of different modalities of the resistance. So the idea of the assembly that reveals who the people are and the coming together of strangers, the civil and public servants who are non-compliant, the angry White House staffer, the rogue NASA folks, right? And then there is the university. And there was an optimism in your presentation of what we at the university can do that I don't necessarily feel, at least here at UCLA or more broadly as we look around universities in North America. So my perhaps more cynical or even sort of a heartbroken view of this is that perhaps because we've become so thoroughly a neoliberalized global university, right? The sort of fundraising apparatus for the hollowed out state and actually for the military-industrial complex, that I find that the response has been, on the one hand, an assertion, a necessary assertion of distance and neutrality, right? We can't get involved in partisan issues. Or, in fact, already an eagerness to align, and that is, in fact, the language already being used in documents throughout the UC system, an eagerness to align with the priorities of the Trump administration in the name of renewal funding for our labs, in the name of federal grants, and on and on and on. Such that it becomes very difficult to think about what our, not as individual scholars, not even as intellectuals, but what this institution's withdrawal of consent or non-compliance might look like.
Well, first of all, one of the things that Hannah Arendt was up against, and we may find ourselves up against it as well, who knows, is that in the 1930s, especially towards the end of the 1930s, German professors who were always civil servants, right? They're hired by the state. They're state functionaries, basically. They had to sign loyalty oaths to the Nazi regime. And I think what was so hideous for her to understand is how many actually did. And so it was intellectuals who decided to keep their state funding and their state position rather than oppose a fascist regime, even as they saw their Jewish colleagues being forced out and deported or fleeing. So she was in a particular situation. I don't know whether the loyalty oath that we will be asked to take will put us in a similar situation. But I think what she thought was that they lacked courage. Now, I think it does relate to what Ananya has just said, because we're seeing administrators who are, yes, nervous about funding, let's be compliant, all those federal grants, we really need them, we can't function without them. Apparently UC Travel is already asking questions like, who are you going to see when you go to certain countries? You get to say, I'm not going to tell you. But what I am interested in, and maybe why, I'm not sure I'm optimistic, I guess I'm trying to rouse optimism, right? So I'm acting as a rhetorician, you know. I'm really trying because I know how bad it is, and I know what I feel like at 3 a.m. when I wake with what I call my political stomach ache. You got it too? Yeah, you got it? Okay, 4. Okay. I would take 4. 4 would be better. But in any case, but look, the thing is that we are in proximity to all these people who are making those decisions within the university. It's not as if they are locked away. They're actually pretty close to us. I mean, it really does matter if people get together and go and confront them, or even in conversations with staff or with departmental chairs or with deans, finding out what is happening, talking to people in the sciences, especially where the federal grants are so huge and where the university is so dependent. Like, what are the specific compromises? And these are local interventions that actually make a difference. And there are people at other universities who are going to want to find out, like, how did you make that intervention and what's going on? And we should have those networks so that we can act, locally and significantly at the same time that we're connected. I'm sure that's not a satisfying answer. I mean, of course, I think what I feel at my university and in other places I've been to is widespread concern, and yes, people showing up for demonstrations and coming to talks, but feeling fundamentally bewildered and confused and not oriented. And I think that is part of the strategy of this administration, to keep us guessing. Like, oh, he said this thing. Is it true? He's for a one-state solution. Oh, my God. It's like, oh, well, actually, he said, I don't really care. It could be a... like, whatever makes a deal, he said. It's like, oh, I see. You haven't even thought about this. Yeah, whatever. I mean, but we get seized, and then the next thing happens, and we're jolted from one thing to the next, rather than kind of pulling back, talking to one another, analyzing the jolting effect, so that we find orientation, we find place, we find commonality, we're able to think, we're able to analyze, we're able to take the time he doesn't take to think, and to think together. I think that we will have large-scale mobilizations, and universities will be at the center of those. I do believe that. I don't know why. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel that where I go. Okay. I mean, you're here. I don't know why you came here today. I don't know what you're thinking. I mean, you knew it wasn't going to be about gender trouble, right?
We appreciate the performative optimism. I have to say, I was rather surprised. But I mean, yes. But the truth is, we are such a group of downers that it's really pretty good. No, this is true. We can produce this, but we can talk. We can talk later about our experience with attempts to discuss with the administration, academic senate, etc. Those are less optimistic outcomes. Yeah. But I want to sort of take seriously the issue of Trump's language. I want to take it seriously because, okay, it's a tactic, it's stuff. Does he read or not? I don't know. But there is something very strange about that level of infantile language. I mean, there is, we all know there are about 4 or 5 words, right? Huge, bad, good, great, big, tremendous. It's but and so this issue about the utterances and their relationship to reality and truth, I think that we're confused because, frankly, it is very, very hard to know how. I mean, there is we all sort of have a certain understanding of what people do with language, and it usually has to do with some correlation with reality and with truth. And even those who don't have a huge vocabulary do make attempts to, make some kind of a convincing attempt. Now, here, I mean, there is almost like the one way to understand it, perhaps, is, and that is what concerns me and makes me a little less optimistic, particularly about the university part and the humanities, etc., which is that ignorance is not just like racism and male chauvinism is not something to be ashamed of. ignorance is something to celebrate because, just like when you don't pay your taxes, it means you're smarter. It's sort of like the same thing. Now, when we're confronted with that, in terms of a resistance, it really poses a problem because, it's like having a kid who is this like bully in the class and everybody's trying to talk and the kid just goes, I mean, what do you do with that, right? So because this is the use of language, I feel like it's not even that. I mean, the part that you identified, which is that there's an utterance and therefore I say, then it will be. What is even more concerning is that I say and it will be, or it won't be, or we'll see, or whatever. Yeah.
Nadia, would you like to add something?
I had a very different question. Should I ask it anyway? And then Judith will somehow make brilliant sense of it all. Yes. So it has to do with the question of violence. We all watched from here as quote-unquote violence broke out at the UC Berkeley campus when Milo showed up. And I wasn't there, but I've been there for similar UC Berkeley barricades. Yes. And one of the things that's striking for me is how then we deal with this question of violence and how we begin to identify and name certain things as violence and not. I'm struck by the ways in which often the destruction of property gets labeled as violence. And of course, that is something we've all vigorously contested. But the often silent but unending negation of personhood is not easily visible as violence, right? So the Muslim ban is not perceived as violence, but breaking windows and destroying property on the UC Berkeley campus is often labeled violence. And I think your work has repeatedly shown us a way out of that impasse. So I wanted to raise that question again, which relates to your very important, again, insistence on rousing optimism by asking us to think about the methods we use to prefigure the world we want, and how in particular in relation to language, we think about that use of the term violence, and especially in the American context. I grew up in India, and the repertoire of protests would in fact use what is regularly labeled violence here. Right?
Okay, so let's start with the language question first. Maybe what we have to do is take the utterance, the fourth grade bullying utterance, that claims something is true or announces what he'll do or what is the case, and it's false or it's dangerous. And then we have to see what happens as a result. In other words, we don't just stop with the speech act itself. We actually have to see how it gets played out. Does he actually do the thing? Does he try to do it and get thwarted, showing that he doesn't have the power? Does he actually do it, at which point there's opposition to what he's doing? The judiciary, the Ninth Circuit stops him. Let's let it play out as a form of power. Let's not just take it as a punctual act. And I think that sometimes it does materialize as policy and then get stopped, or maybe now it's getting implemented, and sometimes not. So that's the way of not getting seized by it, right? Not being taken up in its grip. Because if we're just responding to the outrage of the Authoritarian Speech Act, then we're like, we can't breathe, we're paralyzed. And that's exactly the game he's playing, which is why we need to see where it's powerful, where it's not. Under what conditions does it lose its power? Under what conditions does it gain, and what can we do about it? In other words, let it become part of a scene and even a narrative structure of some kind. I think that's part of what's going on there. I mean, of course, I agree with you that there are structural and symbolic and physical forms of violence that all are violence. And Ananya, you're right that the decimation of personhood is surely a form of violence. But I think that in the case of the visit of Milo to campus at UC Berkeley, the Black Bloc came. I don't know why it's a bunch of able-bodied white guys who call themselves the Black Bloc. Like, so able-bodied. They were like, oh, wow, like, who has that physicality? I don't know. But, I mean, there's something to be said about that. Anyway, I was a little concerned. But what did they do? They took the barricades. Okay, I mean, I appreciate taking the barricades and doing something else with it. I feel like the demonstrations in Taksim in Istanbul in 2013, everybody took the barricades and they built with them, and they built their own walls, and they built their own protection, or they refigured them and refunctioned them in ways that were very radical. But they took the barricades and they smashed it through the windows of the Martin Luther King Center. That didn't feel right. That just didn't feel right. That means something. I mean, yes, it's where he was speaking, and that was already a travesty. But I don't think we want that building destroyed on the UC Berkeley campus. So I confess to feeling some relief that he was barred from speaking, but I also worry that this particular tactic doesn't emerge from a consensus in a movement. It's a group of people who've decided on their tactics, and there is a by any means necessary group, and I think they're not in touch with the rest of us who are also trying to address this issue. They acted quite independently. So I'm not sure all acts of violence against property would dismay me, but I felt that the symbolic force of that was one that was not very thoughtful, and I guess wrong. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Judith. We're going to open a very short, unfortunately, Q&A session because we're very limited in time. So I'm going to ask you to ask a question, preferably no comment, and ask a question and be very concise because we're very, there are many people here. So Sandra, can you speak up or come on stage too? Okay. Thank you.
Yes, of course. You did make reference to what I've talked about with regard to UCLA travel and compliance. I got another follow. This is about the UCLA travel requesting that we get permission to travel to Sudan from the Office of Policy, Research Policy, Compliance. I think we're in some trouble when we have departments named compliance. So I would suggest some non-compliance there, and I will indeed be non-compliant. I know I'm not supposed to make a comment. I'm really sorry. So today I got a follow-up. Basically what they want is the name of every single person I'm going to be seeing when I go to Sudan. This is UCLA, mind you. And they also have a list of people that I'm forbidden to talk to in Sudan. So things are not all great here, and at least they should change their name, for crying out loud. But my question, which I guess is probably also a comment, has to do with underestimating intelligence. Making fun is great because we do need a sense of humor. So I think we should all make fun of him as much as we want among ourselves. But I'm really worried about underestimating. And the story I have from Sudan, which has an Islamist government in power, is that Sudanese on the left and liberals kept laughing at the military regime and saying they were stupid. Yes. And that because they were so stupid, they were going to be overthrown any day. That was 25 years ago. So I'm really concerned about our underestimating and wonder if you'd comment on it.
Should we collect a few, or would you?
Sure. Okay. So, can you speak up because we cannot have the microphone? Okay. Yeah. Okay, closer,
Okay, we'll-
if you can.
Close quarters. First and foremost, thank you so much, Professor Butler, for coming. It was truly a pleasure to listen. One of the questions I had when listening to your talk was when you were talking about the way that we protest is going to set a precedent for the future, and the precedent being the type of world that we want to live in. And one of the things that was of concern to me when what you were talking about with Donald Trump, who I would like out of office just as much as anyone else in this room, is that we could use psychiatric means to get him out of office by saying that he is unfit to lead in a mental state where he is pathological and not fit to be the president of the United States, therefore we should impeach him. And the concern to me is that using this form of weaponized psychiatry, which has been used against the LGBTQ community, against blacks, against a whole group of people who it, has been used to marginalize, if that sets a precedent for the type of future that we want to live in, is that the right means to get someone out of office? It's been done in the Soviet Union with sluggish schizophrenia. Is it the right tactical means to use to get Donald Trump out of office? Thank you so much.
Wonderful. We'll take one more here.
Oh, this is going to be awkward. Okay, sorry guys, this is really vulgar. I just had a question that follows up on your response to Milo, which I hadn't thought of in those terms exactly. And my question is, do you then think, not in terms of the opposition, but the resistance, that are you saying that a condition is that it has to be safe and accessible? Because my thought was my friends at Berkeley who were undocumented couldn't go because police violence broke out and they were excluded from that. And so if you could expand on that, that would be really helpful because it is about methods that we use moving forward.
Any others?
Yes. Well, Sandra, first of all, thank you for all the extraordinary work you have done. You're a real inspiration for many of us who see how you have engaged politically as an academic and as an intellectual. And I agree. I mean, he could be dumb in some ways and really smart in others and really dangerous as well. So I think there is, I've worried about my own cultural elitism in making fun of him. Like I'm reconstituting myself as the cultural elite. But I think maybe one of the reasons why one has to figure out what the passions are and go on Breitbart and listen to what they have to say about fascist feminists and the rest is so that one actually tries to listen a bit more carefully to what the passions are that got tapped and that are still being tapped by this presidency. And that maybe is the place where I'm taking views seriously that I very much disdain. In order to understand where they come from and how they might be turned in another way. But I do take your point. I also think the point about using psychiatric power to take him down is a very important one. I think we can get excited about the possibility that there are psychiatrists who are somehow diagnosing at a distance. But I think you are probably right that that's not the power that we need to delegitimate him. I think if he is erratic and inconsistent and contradictory and breaks the law, then we don't actually need to know what his mental state is in order to say that he's done something radically unjustified. So I take that point as well. It is depoliticizing, yes. It gives greater power to the psychiatric regime, and that's a political problem that we need to think carefully about. So that question, I think, was a good one. You know, one reason why it's really important when we think about activism or resistance, we very often have images of like going to assemblies and coming up against police power and putting our bodies on the line. And I've done that, and I've written about that, and I think that what it takes to mobilize in that way and to face police power is enormously difficult, and I have great respect for people who do it. At the same time, there are a lot of us who cannot do that, right? We're not able-bodied enough to do that, and it's not the only form of resistance that is worthwhile. It's the courageous physical form, but it does involve certain ideas of the body, of youth, of ability that I think we need to kind of call into question, even though I'm in favor of that as one possible action, which is why networks are extremely important, and digital activism is extremely important, and investigative journalism is extremely important, and networks of support, for people who are taking great risks in their profession and in their lives is enormously important. That's why I added interdependency as a value there at the end.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you. Thank you.